Thanks to all of our co-sponsors for the event this morning, and particularly to the University of Gothenburg for hosting us here. I will be presenting this morning particularly on global forest and community tenure trends, and talking about touching on progress as well as slowdown and links to climate outcomes. More specifically, I'll be presenting the findings of two recent publications, both of which in different ways are focused on the centrality of community forest rights to the future of forests. The first of these two publications is an RRI publication called What Future for Reform. This is the third in a series of publications since 2002 that have tracked what we call the forest tenure transition. Well, what do we mean by this? I mean, as many of you will know, in many parts of the world, forests have been held historically by indigenous peoples and local communities under customary tenure systems. Though in many of these areas, colonial and post-colonial states have claimed those forest lands and directly managed them. So, and under formal legal systems, statutory legal systems, have owned and managed those forests. However, with the first publication in 2002, looking at the transition of tenure, we started to see that both on the basis of human rights and the growing recognition of the fact that indigenous peoples and local communities held customary rights to those forests, and on the basis of recognition of the effectiveness of community-based management, there was starting to be a change where governments were recognizing and handing over various types of forest tenures to local communities and indigenous peoples. The second report that I'll be presenting on is a more recent report, came out just in July, that we prepared in collaboration with the World Resources Institute based in Washington, D.C., on securing rights and combating climate change. And this focuses in particular on the importance of these community forest rights and recognition of forest rights as a climate change solution. Okay, so starting with the What Future for Reform and the tenure transition. One of our main findings from this report, looking at the period 2002 to 2013, is that the global forest tenure transition has continued. There's a lot of information on this slide, so let me go through it piece by piece. One thing this slide shows is the four categories that we have used to track changes in statutory forest tenure. So the first category is areas that are under statutory law directly owned and administered by governments. Again, of course, we know that customary, many of these areas are held under customary tenure by indigenous peoples and local communities, but under the formal legal systems of these countries, these are owned and administered by government. The second category we have called designated for indigenous peoples and communities, and these are lands that have been where certain community rights have been recognized by governments, often rights to manage and to use timber and non-timber resources, for example, under community forestry frameworks. However, the rights are conditional and they don't fulfill the full legal means to secure community tenure. The third category, which we've termed owned by indigenous peoples and local communities, has often been a kind of recognition of a fuller set of rights, and often has involved recognition of customary tenure, for example, in large parts of the Amazon region. And the main criteria for this category of ownership are that in addition to management and use, communities have the legal right to exclude outsiders, that they hold rights in perpetuity, and that they have rights to due process and just compensation. And then the fourth category is forest lands owned by firms and individuals. So what we see over the period of time 2002 to 2013, and the blue is 2002 and the green is 2013, is again that the forest tenure transition has continued in that the area under statutory law that's administered by government has decreased. The areas designated for Indigenous peoples and local communities and owned by Indigenous peoples and local communities have increased, so that as of 2013, it's a total of 15.5% of the global forest estate. And the area owned by firms and individuals has also increased, but just slightly. If we look at the subset of countries that are lower and middle income countries, and this acronym refers to lower and middle income countries, over the same period of time, we actually see an even more significant change. So that the two categories of community tenure, of designated for and owned by Indigenous peoples and local communities, have increased from a combined total of 21% of forest lands in those countries to more than 30%. And this is based on a sample of 33 countries that represents about 85% of the forests in those lower and middle income countries. So that's the good news, you could say, that the transition has continued. At the same time, there are a number of problems that we've identified. One is that this progress has been very uneven across regions. If you disaggregate the situation in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, we see that in 2013, in Latin America, about 43% of forests are still owned and administered by governments under statutory law. A total of 39% is either owned by or designated for Indigenous peoples and local communities, with the majority of that 33% being owned. So that's quite a significant change. In Africa, we see a very different picture, which is that most forest lands continue to be held and administered by governments, and there's much more limited recognition, some under community forestry regimes, and actually no recorded area under community ownership, though there are some legal frameworks that recognize customary tenure. And then Asia, in aggregate, kind of falls somewhere in the middle between the situation in Africa and in Latin America. However, if you unpack the situation in Asia to separate out the effect of China, which actually contains 3/4 of the forests that are classified as being owned by communities in the Asia region, we actually see a much less progressive picture, where still 76% of forests are administered by governments, and much smaller proportions, just 10%, are owned by Indigenous peoples and local communities, and 10% under community management and use. And in particular, in the picture in Asia, it includes the situation of Indonesia and much of peninsular Southeast Asia, where we know that there's a very high proportion of customary lands, but very limited formal recognition. And the same is true in Africa, in the previous slide, where much of that area that's under government administration, we know is held under various forms of customary tenure as well. Another concern that we uncovered in the analysis that we did of the period 2002 to 2013 is that recognition of community forest rights has slowed since 2008. So among the lower and middle income countries, we broke down the findings between the period 2002 to 2008 and then the period 2008 to 2013. And the blue is the first period and the green is the second. And found that both the pace of recognition the pace of recognition of community forest rights in both the designated for categories and the owned by categories have decreased very dramatically in the owned by category. It has also decreased, though less dramatically, the area recognized as designated for Indigenous peoples and local communities. We were interested to see, given that the security of tenure, including community tenure, has been a very prominent part of the discussions around REDD+. We also broke down these findings for the countries that have been developing REDD+ strategies and initiatives, and found that the picture is not really very much different, and that it's actually a large subset of these lower and middle income countries. This finding in relation to the area recognized is also paralleled by findings about legal reforms. In the period 2002 to 2008, there were about 18 new laws that were enacted by governments in the lower and middle income countries to recognize community forest tenure in different forms. But there were only 6 new laws that were enacted in the period 2008 to 2013. And they were also weaker, and particularly none of the new legal frameworks created since 2008 recognize community ownership of forest lands. So we're seeing a real slowdown in the rate and in the robustness of the community forest tenure frameworks. So this was very much of a concern, but also somewhat as a surprise. A surprise, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of attention and concern with tenure issues as an aspect of climate change mitigation. And we started talking with colleagues at the World Resources Institute, who do a lot of climate and in ecosystems analysis, and asked them if they would take a look at the situation, not from the kind of human rights perspective that RI brings to its work, but really more from a climate and forest deforestation perspective, and to look at the evidence base for the links between securing community forest tenure and forest and climate outcomes. Because we felt, and this was a concern shared by our colleagues at WRI, that this was an undervalued approach, that there wasn't getting enough attention concretely in climate initiatives. So some of the main findings from this report are that, first, community forests sequester massive amounts of carbon. So just looking at I had mentioned earlier that based on our tenure tracking, 15.5% of the world's forests are legally recognized as being owned by or designated for indigenous peoples and local communities. So just looking at those areas under legal recognition, they contain 37.7 billion tons of carbon, which if it were released into the atmosphere would be equivalent to 29 times the annual carbon footprint of all passenger vehicles in the world. So this is a very significant amount of carbon, and of course, if we take into account the areas under community forest management that isn't legally recognized, it would be much greater. A second main finding is that deforestation rates inside indigenous and community forests that have legal recognition and strong government protection are significantly lower than in forests outside these areas. So based on both review of the scientific literature as well as some additional satellite-derived data analyses and GIS analyses that were conducted for this report, some examples of the differences are in the Brazilian Amazon. The deforestation rates inside indigenous and community lands are about 11% lower than areas outside. In the Bolivian Amazon, 6% lower, and in parts of the Guatemalan Petén, 20% lower. 20 times lower. This is a photograph or one slide from a time series data of WRI's Global Forest Watch data. This slide is from 2013. The gray areas are indigenous and community lands, and the kind of white areas are outside of those lands, and the red is deforestation. And so what the time series shows, starting in 2001, is that there's much greater deforestation in the areas outside the community lands, but a very strong protective effect within them. So what's needed based on the analysis that we did? Well, we kind of zeroed in on really 2 key factors. One of them is the foundation of legal recognition of indigenous peoples and community forest rights. But then a second key element is government support for protection and enforcement of those rights. Much of the literature that we looked at for this study, it was about 130 reports and analyses focused on 14 countries. And across those 14 countries, many of them had a base of recognition of legal rights, varying strengths of recognition. And what we found was where that was also coupled with government support for demarcation, for titling, expelling of encroachers, not allocating industrial concessions on top of community forests, there tended to be good strong forest outcomes. In cases where there was legal recognition but a lack of government protection and enforcement, sometimes communities were still able to overcome that lack of support, but often as not, this resulted in greater deforestation in those areas. And then in cases where you had both a lack of legal recognition and a lack of government support, we tended to have very high deforestation rates and corresponding carbon emissions. So this is my last slide. Some concluding recommendations from these two reports and pieces of analysis. The first one is to both legally recognize and support community forest rights and management. So this is primarily a call to national governments. And I note here that this is especially both continuing in but moving beyond Latin America. The reason for this is that we think that one of the reasons for the slowdown that we've been able to observe from the forest tenure data is that much of the reform that we've seen over the 2002 to 2013 period has come from the Latin America region. It's not completed. There's still many areas where indigenous and community forest rights still need to be recognized within Latin America. But if we're going to continue the pace of change and tenure transition that we've seen, it's going to mean stronger results in and more kind of stronger political will for reform in regions that have not been so active in forest tenure reforms up until now. Secondly, to provide more concrete support from climate initiatives and to do more to value community forest rights as a climate solution. I've talked about this with the report. A third recommendation that we have that other speakers will be talking about more over the course of the day is to engage private sector corporations and investors in respecting community forest rights. One of the reasons for this is that we observe that the slowdown that we documented in recognition of community forest rights coincides with the commodities boom and with the expansion of industrial concessions across much of the developing world. Which means that the private sector needs to be engaged as part of the solution. And then our fourth recommendation is to catalyze the kind of broad-based change that we need to see by national governments, by the international community, by the private sector, climate community, and others, by including community land rights in the post-2015 development agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny.